Hey YouTube, if you are a subscriber of this channel, then you know for our numbered episodes, we typically only show you the episode artwork and a bouncing soundbar. Well, this week we're trying something new. You will see my interview with Kevin Hozer, our first return guest. And for you World War II history buffs out there, get ready because Hozer is here to talk all about the pivotal World War II naval battle that turned the tide in the Pacific. It's the Battle of Midway, and it's here today on the Fighter Pilot Podcast.
Strap in for the Fighter Pilot Podcast, the internet radio show that explores the fascinating world of air combat, the aircraft, the weapon systems, and most importantly, the people. Now, here's your host, retired U.S. Navy fighter pilot Vincent Aiello.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. I am your host, Jello, and this is episode 114. Now, if you're listening to this episode on release day, June 4th, 2021, then two things are true. Probably a lot more than just two, but bear with me. Anyway, I am in my last day of refresher training with my airline, following not flying since last October. And also, today is the 79th anniversary of the World War II Battle of Midway. Now, I don't know about you, but I've heard of the Battle of Midway. I could probably find the island on a map. I know there's an airport in Chicago named after it, but really, what's the big deal? Why all the fuss? What is so notorious about the Battle of Midway, and why did it change naval aviation forever? Well, that's what we're talking about today on this episode. And this episode is unlike any other because for the first time, we are welcoming back our first repeat guest. Now, we've had guests come back as co-hosts, but in this case, we've got a second-time guest. You remember retired United States Navy Captain Kevin Miller from episode 20, After the Cockpit. Hozer, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Jello. Thanks. Great to be with you again.
For sure. Well, what's new with you? I mean, we've seen you on, I think you helped us with a Facebook Live session, or we've done some other stuff, but what's new just with you?
I'm researching another Flip Wilson book, and
All right.
I'll start writing that later this year. It's kind of going to promote everybody, and we'll start out in the Eastern Med, and we'll cause trouble and go from there.
Well, that sounds good. All right. Well, it's good to get an update on you, and you're still down there in the panhandle of Florida, I presume?
Yep, right here in the cradle of naval aviation.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we learned all about you last time, so this episode is going to be unlike any other, as we said, because we don't have to ask where you're from and what you did in the Navy and all that. The listener can find that on episode 20, and we don't have to ask you about your call sign again. But we do have our usual format we'd like to follow. We have some listener questions. We'll hold those until we talk about the battle, and then a couple just quick announcements. So you and I have kept pretty busy over the last year and some change, adapting your book. Like you said, Flip Wilson is back. He started off in Raven 1 is where we met him. And we've been adapting that series to DCS. So remind us where we've been and what we're working on now.
Yes, Raven 1, Dominant Fury. And this is a prequel DCS campaign, if you will. Flip is now a junior department head before his famous or infamous Raven 1 deployment in Hormuz. And Ward Valley Forge, again, the Eastern Med, and lots of new missions that we're building in conjunction with the BVR team, of course, which is Baltic Dragon and RG. In the past couple of years and couple of months, DCS has put out a lot of new updates for Supercarrier and the aircraft. So we're going to leverage those and put together a pretty fun game. It has been fun developing it.
Yes, and it's been fun watching you on Twitter. I know you've been engaging a lot with the DCS community. They've all very well received, I would say, the Raven 1 that we put out in 2020, I guess it was.
Yes.
And so it's been a lot of fun working on this one with you. I know we've spent a lot of hours brainstorming different missions.
We're getting it right.
Yeah. And the fun part, I think, is well, wait a minute. If Flip does this in the prequel, maybe that would have changed the canon, right? Or the universe of later. So he can't necessarily have ejected. Hope we're not giving away too many secrets here because an ejection is a big deal. And he can't really shoot down aircraft and he can't do a lot of other things. But I think it's still going to be a really, really fun DCS campaign. And we're moving towards, are we allowed to say when we think this is going to come out?
I think we are, and this year, the fall, I believe we have another handful of missions to do. They're going to be big ones, using the Syria map that the DCS players love. It's a terrific map, and it's real world. There's plenty to do there. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it has been exciting developing this one. All of us have learned more about DCS and how we can make a better mission. So this one
Yeah.
is going to raise the bar.
For sure. And it's always fun when the three of us, like you said, Baltic Dragon's a part of this, get our heads together and we try to balance the realism that we'd like our campaigns to be known for, but also with enjoyment for the player. So we might take some liberties, if I may say, with how likely maybe could this be. But if it did happen, this is what the comms might sound like. This is what the tactics would be, to within reason, of course.
Yes.
And so I think that's some of the credibility that you and I lend to these campaigns. And so we hope for that later in 2021, like you said, and we hope it is well received. And it's been a lot of fun working on it.
It sure has. Yes, we take a little bit of artistic license, but we keep it real.
Okay. All right, Hoser. Well, let's get to the point now. Next year it'll be 80 years. And so maybe we can revisit this then. But this is, as I said at the top, the anniversary of the Battle of Midway. And you are, dare I say, an expert on this because you've written a book. So actually, if you don't mind, let's start there. Remind us the name of the book and a little bit about it. Because I think when we met you back on episode 20, I think it was still fairly far off at that point.
Yes, and I hadn't even finished the Raven One trilogy then, but the Silver Waterfall, and the Silver Waterfall is historic fiction about the Battle of Midway, and I wrote it without changing any facts of the battle. I did a lot of research uh, here in Pensacola, the National Naval Aviation Museum, primary source documents, fascinating, and just a perspective that as a former carrier aviator can bring. So the Silver Waterfall was published last June 4th, coming up on
Okay.
a year. And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
All right. Well, I will refrain for your benefit, Hoser, referring to your book like a certain movie about a ship sinking, which is a factual account with a fictional tale of some lovers. And so I won't do that anymore because it's always awkward. But the point being is, you took the factual events of the Battle of Midway, which we'll dive into here in a moment, and you applied what the crews might have been thinking, what they might have said. You did real research on the era and you just tried to give us something so instead of reading about the facts we could live it with the cruise. Is that essentially it?
Yes, and modeled this after Michael Shara's outstanding "The Killer Angels" about the Battle of Gettysburg, and so through that book, he brought that battle alive. It was adapted into the movie that everyone has probably seen, Gettysburg, with Martin Sheen as Robert E. Lee, Jeff Daniels as Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Uh, what actually happened at Midway does not need any embellishment. And just talking about what the real men who fought it went through, and try to put some emotion and feeling as to what they were experiencing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you can see it there. It's right on the end of my bookshelf behind
Yes.
me, and I enjoyed it very much. And so, all right, well, let's jump into it now. First off, where is Midway Island, and what was the island's significance in early 1942?
Midway is in the middle of the largest geographic feature on Earth, the Pacific Ocean. It's about 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii, which itself is probably the most isolated place on Earth. Midway, before the war, was a refueling stop for the Pan Am Clipper, but as war clouds gathered in the Pacific, it was a fortified base. In early 1942, after the fall of Wake, Midway was our westernmost outpost in the Pacific.
Okay. Have you ever been there?
No, never been there.
Oh, me
How about
neither.
you?
No, I've not. I flew by it. I wouldn't say recently. It's been a year, but I was on my airline capacity flying from Hawaii to somewhere in Japan. I forget suddenly. And we went very near it and I tried to take a picture. And of course, it was very blurry.
Well, I was an Atlantic Fleet sailor, so
Okay. So can you describe the Imperial Japan's Pacific conquests up until June 1942? And I think a lot of listeners are probably familiar with December 7th, 1941.
yes. Well, Yamamoto said, he would run wild for 6 months, and after that, he had no guarantee. And so he did run wild. And the Japanese, in short order, conquered the Philippines. Uh, they got the Dutch East Indies, the vital oil supplies in Borneo. They attacked Singapore. They sunk the Royal Navy battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales. They attacked Darwin in northern Australia and kept them out of the fight. They went into the Indian Ocean where the Royal Navy had a carrier task force, sank the carrier Hermes, attacked the Royal Navy base at Trincomalee. So they had uncontested command of the Western Pacific Ocean and into the Indian Ocean.
Now, as we sit here in 2021, obviously we have the benefit of knowing history and how it ends up. But I have to think, January, February 1942, for the Allies, it must have seemed very bleak in the Pacific.
It absolutely was. However, we did attack, and in February of 1942, and this is the action with Butch O'Hare, saving Lexington off Bougainville. I mean, well into the Western Pacific. The United States was attacking Japanese outposts in the Marshalls of Carolines, and these were pinprick attacks. They weren't really militarily significant. The Japanese kind of ignored them, but Yamamoto knew in the back of his mind that because the carriers were not affected at all on December 7th, he had to eventually deal with them.
Hmm.
Then in April of 1942, the Doolittle raid, and that was a game changer for Japan. I mean, the empire, the homeland was attacked. The emperor was put at risk. And so Japan had to then, move resources to defend the home islands, which they never thought would be attacked, certainly not in April of 1942.
Well, okay. So was the attack on Midway a surprise? And I think for those who follow even a little bit of history, this is kind of a loaded question. This is one thing I do know about the Battle of Midway.
Was it a surprise? It might have been a surprise to the Japanese that morning. It certainly was that morning that the Americans were there, but no, through painstaking mathematical calculation over a period of months, the guys at Station Hypo and Makalapa Hill had broken most of the Japanese code. And this is led by the Lieutenant Commander Joseph Roquefort and Nimitz's intel officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton. And so together they had pieced these little snippets of radio comm. They kind of get a bearing and where they are, and they could even tell which types of ships were transmitting Morse code is what we're talking about. And they brought this information to Admiral Nimitz and said they're gonna strike at Midway. So this was transmitted to Washington. And Washington, which always has the answer, no, they're going to strike at Johnston Island. And so to prove to Washington that they were going to strike at Midway, this is the famous ruse about Midway's desalinization plant. And so they, in the clear, they said, hey, our plant's on the fritz. And the Japanese picked that up. And so again, Nimitz's team, Roquefort and Layton, they knew the Japanese were going to Midway. And that ruse was to prove to Washington that they were. The movie Midway that came out 2 years ago in 2019 did a very good job of talking about that effort and the use of radio intelligence. That was very well done in the movie.
That part of it, yeah. What was if I may ask you, what was your overall thought of that movie?
It's good. And I wrote a review, actually. It's in my blog, kevinmillerauthor.com. But it's good that Hollywood made a movie about that battle, about a historic event like that. I mean, we get a lot of, what Hollywood feeds us. And but the CGI, it was just so much it distracted. The reputations of actual men who were there were impugned. There's here's Roquefort drinking on the job. Here's a drunken Richard Best yelling at Nimitz. Spruance and McCluskey don't look too strong, so that was a disappointment. But again, people like us can go bring our families and friends to the movie, and then we can be the experts and talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I I have a very similar, I would say, reaction to it. At the very beginning, there was maybe you know the name of the officer at Pearl Harbor who was yelling at one of his sailors, and then a moment later he's killed, and there's this sad funeral, and we're all supposed to feel bad for him. We're like, no, that guy was a jerk. So I
Yeah.
felt they didn't quite develop the characters well enough, and I had a difficult time keeping track of who was who, even though I think they tried very hard to do that. And then at the end, they showed us the real pictures and summary of them. But certainly a lot of names, anyone even mildly interested in war history or naval aviation will recognize. McCluskey, we have an award given out to fighter squadrons every year for him. Nimitz, of course, and so many others. And so, yeah, I'm with you. I'm glad they tried, but I felt it missed the mark a little bit. I was
Yes.
a little bit disappointed, but at any rate, I thought your book was much more enjoyable. But books versus movies, not to go on a too big a tangent, you can always read better what the folks are thinking in a book than you can try to imagine what Hollywood is telling you
Yes.
through the scenes. So, all right, getting back to it. So, the Battle of Midway was different, right? I mean, it was significant compared to that point in history.
Yes. 1 month before, at Coral Sea, the American carriers had met and thwarted the Japanese advance uh, to cut off the sea lines of communication to Australia. They were going to attack and take Port Moresby in New Guinea, and then Australia would really be in trouble. And so we sent two carriers, Lexington and Yorktown. On the first day, they found and sank the Japanese light carrier Shoho, but then the next day, the Japanese got through and and fatally damaged Lexington. We did some damage though on two of their Pearl Harbor carriers. This was Shokaku and Zoikaku. We were able to pretty much decimate the air wing of one and damage the other ship. So those carriers could not participate 1 month later at Midway. Yorktown was damaged, and this is the famous story that she made her way back to Pearl Harbor, trailing a slick of oil, and in dry dock. And they said, Admiral Nimitz, it's going to take us months to turn her around for combat. And he said, gentlemen, I need this ship in 3 days. And they made it happen where the Japanese didn't. And had they, as we'll discuss, I'm sure that could have carried the day for them.
Yeah. So Midway was that, and again, this is where my naval history is not as sharp. Is this the one credited as the first naval battle where the opposing ships didn't see each
Coral
other, or
Sea.
was
I'm
that
sorry, I didn't answer you. Coral Sea was the first battle in
okay?
history where opposing ships did not see each other. So just a month later, we're off Midway. So the same setup. Our ships, although there are exceptions, we had the submarine Nautilus that got in among the Japanese screen, and of course the Japanese had a submarine that dealt with Yorktown later in the battle. We're talking ranges of 150 to 200 miles between what we would call strike groups, task forces.
And so prior to that, if I may simplify naval warfare, especially anyone who's seen any of the Pirates of the Caribbean type shows, right? You pull two ships up next to each other, you slug it out, and one ends up victorious. Now, the ships leading up to Coral Sea and then Midway are more of an extension of the weapon system to launch the aircraft. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Okay.
Uh, and so the battleship. Now, the battleship was still thought of as the primary naval weapon, even after Pearl Harbor,
Hmm.
and even by the Japanese, who had taught the world a lesson that the battleship was not the primary naval combatant. Battleship guns, big guns, we're talking 14-inch, 16-inch guns, 15, 20 miles. Obviously, an airplane, a little aluminum airplane, can pack a 1,000-pound weapon, can pack a 2,000-pound torpedo, and do severe damage. And they'll swarm around those ships. And obviously, the Japanese had sunk the Royal Navy battleships earlier in the war.
Mhm. Yeah.
So this was but the Japanese still were wedded to the battleship being the primary decider of naval combat. And here's how they did it. They planned that their aircraft carriers would attack Midway on June 4th. The next day, they would land on Midway and take it, and that would prompt the Americans to come out and fight. They didn't think the Americans would fight. They thought the Americans were inept, cowardly, and they weren't watching because, again, in February 1942, we're in their backyard with Butch O'Hare. All through the early months, we're in the Marshalls and Carolines, the Doolittle Raid, Coral Sea. We absolutely brought the fight to them early in the war, but they still didn't pick that up.
So if this was mainly a battle between aircraft, how did the aircraft stack against each other? Who had the advantage?
Well, the United States, as it always does, went to war with what it had.
Mhm.
And what we had in 1941 was the Wildcat fighter. And the Wildcat was a great little airplane, but it was not as great as the Japanese A6M Zero fighter, which could out-turn it, out-climb it. It had much more range, significantly more range than a Wildcat. What the Zero could not, dive as well as the Wildcat. You get that beer barrel fuselage going downhill, and the Zero couldn't hang. But in every other regime, it did quite well. The torpedo bombers, the Japanese had the Nakajima B-5N, what we know as the Kate, and that designation came later in the war, the Kate and the Val. The 200 knots, very effective airplane, a great torpedo bomber at Pearl Harbor, as we all saw, a high-level bomber, very capable airplane. What we had was the 5-year-old TBD Devastator with carrying a 2,000-pound torpedo, but the cruising speed of a Devastator was only 110 knots.
Oof.
And so you think about that, you and I could not have landed a Hornet that slow, back in the day. And that was their cruising speed. And they had to slow to 80 knots at 80 feet at about 800 yards to drop that thing. So imagine, chasing down a ship and you might have, 80 knots of closure on it. It's going to just take forever, and you're just getting beat up. You've got a radioman gunner behind you to do the best that he can. And so not good. Now, but we did have one secret weapon, maybe not secret, but the SBD Dauntless dive bomber was probably the finest dive bomber in the world at the time. It was much better than the Japanese Val with fixed landing gear. The German Stuka, even then, but they didn't fly it like the Americans did. The Dauntless was designed to roll into a 90-degree dive and put out dive brakes first, roll into a 90-degree dive, and then the pilot is looking through a tube with the crosshairs, and he's tracking the target that's going through the water. Imagine doing that, and there's no shoulder harness. You kind of lighten your seat. You got a seat belt. That's it. Your canopy is open. You're in low blower for your engine, and as you're diving on this target at 240 knots, your left hand is working the trim, just like we used to do in flight school, to make sure that we're in balanced flight. The radioman gunner would swivel around and call out altitudes. So he would face forward, stow the gun, and face forward. And inside 4,000 feet, he'd call every 100 feet. So 39, 38, 37, 36, all the way down to about 2,000 feet. And that's where the pilot would pickle. And on the older models that the Marines flew from Midway, you would reach down by your left foot and yank up on a handle that would release the weapon. And so at that point, you would pull on the pole, and I've read accounts, two hands, and just unaided 9, 10 G's, and pull out right above the water. The gunner would swivel around, get the gun out, and start fighting. Isn't that amazing?
That's
and
incredible.
Yes, and that's what those guys did. And so you think later in the war, we experienced a Japanese kamikaze weapon. So that was the same thing, except those last 2 seconds, the human guidance system in a kamikaze would fly right into the target. So it was an absolutely precision weapon that the United States had, and the American carrier dive bomber crews knew how to use it.
Yeah. Well, in your book, Silver Waterfall, you spent some time with aviators on the USS Hornet, but they didn't really find glory on the morning of June 4th. So why didn't they? What happened with them finding the Japanese? And we have a listener question, by the way, to this effect a little bit later.
Okay. Hornet was a new ship. It had been commissioned in October. in Norfolk, and so the war started, and they went through the Panama Canal and up, and they went to San Francisco, put on the Doolittle Raiders in San Francisco, and there's not much time to train. I mean, this is a new air wing, new ship. You gotta work the bugs out, as we know. They deliver the Doolittle Raiders, come back, and they had a very short training period. So this was their first time. I mean, this is the World Series, and really a unproven ship air wing team. So there was difficulty getting those guys airborne that morning. There was a lot of drama on the bridge about where the fighters should be, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. But the Americans were given a heading of 240, 238, basically southwest, and expected to be 150 miles or so from where we launched that morning. The Enterprise aircraft, they flew the same heading, and Enterprise and Hornet were together, but the air wings took off and headed out at different times. Wade McCluskey, famously, as we know, he got to the end of his leg and they weren't there, and he decided to turn right to the northwest and eventually north and found them. Ring, and there was a lot of questionable behavior going on in Air Group 8, got to the end and turned south toward Midway, thinking maybe that's where the Japanese went.
So the fellows McCluskey turning north found them, and Ring turning south did not. Is that
and it gets worse?
Okay.
The way that the Hornet launched this, and this is, this was custom. You launch the fighters first, and then because they got to defend everyone, and then you launch the dive bombers. So they have a shorter roll. Then the torpedo planes, because they're carrying those big torpedoes, and that's a much longer flight deck roll. That makes sense. So you launch the fighters and dive bombers. Then you have to bring up the torpedo planes from the hangar bay, and that takes time. You got to spot them and warm them up. It takes time. So the guys are circling overhead and chewing up gas. But they all did leave Hornet at the same time. There's photographic evidence of BT-8 led by Waldron, and above them is the dive bombers led by the group commander Ring. Halfway there, the fighters ran out of gas and turned around, and they couldn't find Hornet, and they all ditched. So all the escort fighters were lost, and a couple of the pilots were never found. The dive bombers, the bombing squadron, Bombing 8, carrying the big 1,000-pounders, they said, we can't do this. So their CO took them to Midway, and they landed at Midway and refueled and came back. The scouting squadron said, we're out of gas, and they turned around on their own. And they went back to Hornet still with their 500-pound bombs on their racks. Just, we would call this a goat rope. And
it didn't start well.
Not at all. And it was just a disaster for Hornet that morning.
Okay.
And then there's VT-8. So VT-8 halfway through, and this is Waldron and Ring, and they were arguing that morning. And Ring said, okay, look, they're heading 240. That's what we've been assigned. And Waldron said, no, that's wrong. They're farther north than that. This is where they're gonna launch. There's no reason they would close Midway. They would move away. No, 240. And Ring said, I'm telling you, sir, 250, 255. Nope. Okay. Well, Waldron said, can I have a couple of fighters? No. Can I have one fighter? No. Can I have one fighter and one of my guys will fly it? And the answer is no. And Captain Mitscher, Mark Mitscher, the legend of Leyte Gulf, is the captain of Hornet now. And it's his air wing, and he decides how they're employed in those days. So Waldron, didn't get what he needed, going the wrong heading. He's flying these old airplanes that don't have a lot of range. I mean, we got to get right to him. So halfway through, John Waldron took his squadron and left. Can you imagine just taking your squadron and just leaving the air wing formation and going off on your own?
He was convinced he was right.
And he was right. And George Gay, in his account, said that he took the squadron to the Japanese as if he had a string tied to them. And of course, to their death. The Japanese were there waiting for him with 40 zeros.
Oh, wow. Oh, all right. So we're getting into this, but I want to go back to the dive bombers and your book. The cover of the Silver Waterfall is really striking, and I know that expression shows up in the book. What is depicted there, and who do we credit for that?
noted aviation artist Wade Myers, and I've seen Wade Myers' work, and I was connected to him, so I knew that I wanted a cover, an original cover, an accurate cover to match the accuracy and research in the text. So Wade and I talked. Okay, this we're going to show Best, Krager, and Weber from Bombing 6 on Enterprise, and there had been another goat rope between the Enterprise dive bombers that morning. Okay, who's attacking what ship, and we can talk about that. But it was just a mess. And so Best took his two wingmen over to Akagi to save the day. So that is them in their and the bomb will come off at a 70-degree dive. And you can see that the yoke there that swings it clear of the propeller. And it's kind of comes off and then it retracts back there. So you see Best and Krager are releasing, and Weber, he's waiting to get down to 2,000 feet where he releases. You can see in that image a couple of wisps of AAA. So the Japanese on Akagi saw them and fired. Best in his account said he didn't see it, but Krager, number 2, did. And it's just the sun angle, what it evokes. Very, very pleased with it.
Yeah. Hozer, so you've already sort of touched on this, but I mean, this is unlike anything you and I did, even 60 years later, let alone 80 as we are now. I mean, like not knowing where the fleet is, flying propeller aircraft running out of fuel, flying at, what'd you say, 80 knots to release a torpedo. That's basically a sitting duck. I mean, it's incredible what these men went through, and I will deliberately say men because at that time, but it doesn't sound like it started real well. Did the page turn on this? So, I mean, it wasn't just a battle in one day as well.
Yes. At 10 o'clock in the morning on June 4th, no one would give the Americans any chance to win the Battle of Midway. I mean, the guys on Hornet were going the wrong way and had fallen out. The guys on Enterprise were lost at the end of their fuel leg. The guys on Yorktown had just launched at only a half-strength attack, and the Japanese knew where the Americans were. They had found them, finally, gotten an accurate scouting report from one of their scouts. But it was Wade McCluskey. And Wade McCluskey had turned, he had gone an extra 15 minutes, then he paralleled the Japanese course. They still weren't there. So he goes north now, which is kind of back toward home a little bit, but just go a little bit further. And he's got binoculars and he's looking through the breaks in the clouds. It was clear up there, but on the surface it's white. But when you get on top of a break, you can look down into it and see what's there. And so he sees a ship, a single ship. He thinks it's a light cruiser, it's really the destroyer Arashi, that had been prosecuting USS Nautilus that was causing problems for the Japanese an hour earlier. So it's rushing back home to join the rest of the mobile force. McCluskey follows it. And within minutes, he sees below him the mobile force and changes the history of the world.
How many ships are in his field of view at that point, do you think?
The Japanese had 4 carriers, 2 battleships, and a dozen destroyers, half a dozen cruisers, so 20 of various types, and airplanes all over the place. At the same time, VT3 from Yorktown, Torpedoes 3, and VB3 from Yorktown were also attacking from the northeast, and they didn't know that the others were there. So the Yorktown guys get there and they start attacking. The torpedo guys get annihilated. This is where Jimmy Thatch introduces the Thatch weave to good effect. Just tried it in combat, and the Japanese had never seen anything like it. So Bombing 3, led by Max Leslie, and this is the famous thing. Okay, we got these new electrical arming, so let's arm our weapons, and they fall off the airplane halfway there. I mean, can you imagine that? And
No.
so he said, and so he breaks radio silence. Darn it! Probably use a saltier word than that. Don't arm your weapons manually. 2 other guys had dropped their weapons too. So Max Leslie rolls in, just guns blazing. That's all he's got. But his wingmen were able to put 3 bombs into Soryu and just set it ablaze. Absolutely. And Soryu lost about 3/4 of her crew in the conflagration that followed. So the Enterprise guys, they get there, and there was a mix-up. Scouting 6 and Bombing 6 30 airplanes end up rolling on Kaga, the big Japanese carrier. They're separated side by side. There was confusion. So this is where Best takes his two wingmen. Oh, those idiots! And he goes over to Akagi, and one bomb hit Akagi. There was a close paint scraper that Fushida writes about in his book. Then one bomb hit amidships, and another bomb hit very close to the stern. It probably disabled Akagi's rudder. But that one bomb going off in the hangar bay, and hangar bays and Japanese carriers were stacked one on top of another, full of armed and fueled aircraft. That was their policy. They were afraid to do it in the open air on the flight deck because of the specter of enemy strafers. They just cooked off, and the ship was doomed. All of them were doomed.
Wow. Yeah, it's so hard. We sit here and you've done your research and we talk about it, but there's no possible way, I don't feel like, to really feel and experience what they did. I mean, clearly, I'm not saying anything new, but to again, we know the ending also, but to think about the uncertainty, the fear for your life, the wanting to avenge Pearl Harbor, it's
It is,
frankly.
and in those days, and through much of naval aviation, sadly and realistically, pretty dangerous business. And so here you are, and here's young Ensign Clay Fisher, right, just got his wings a few months ago, and he's in an SBD with another human being sitting behind him, and he is assigned to search 200 miles by himself, and so and in an SBD. And it'd probably take him, an hour and a half to get out there. There's no radios. There's no iron. All the toys that we have.
HF and
Yeah,
SAT.
and
Right.
he's looking at the surface of the sea and kind of estimating wind and drift and all that. And then you turn around and you find your way back, and there's no TACAN. There's no Marshall controller to vector you home, and they did it. And so even Ensign Fisher knew how to do that before having to do the real thing in battle.
You said earlier, I just want to clarify for our listeners who might wonder this because I did until I saw that you had specified it in the book. We have VT squadrons today, but it's nothing like the VT squadron then, right? So today you might have VT2, and that's a training squadron, but back then it was a
Yes,
torpedo
correct.
squadron.
VTs are training today. Yes,
Yeah, and we don't have VBs anymore, and then there were a few others, but
we don't even have VF anymore.
that is true. That is true. VF went away in what,
I think so.
2006 with the F-14, 6 or 7. All right. Hey, can we talk a little more about John Waldron? I mean, complex guy. What's the legacy with him?
John Waldron, Annapolis graduate, and came up through the School of Hard Knocks in naval aviation in the 20s and 30s. He's about 40 years old at Midway, and
Okay.
so he's commanding Torpedo Squadron 8, which is the Navy's newest torpedo squadron on the Navy's newest ship, but flying the oldest airplanes. They had hoped they would get the new Grumman TBF Avenger, but they didn't get it in time to bring it to sea. Now there's, students of the battle know that there were VT-8 Avengers on Midway, and they flew into battle that morning from Midway. 6 aircraft, 5 shot down. It's in my novel, but it's also in A Dawn Like Thunder by Robert Mrazek, their story. But Waldron knew that we've got to get in the first blow. It's crucial. Whoever gets the first blow is going to win this battle, whatever it takes. Now, how did he know this? Now, he had participated, as all the aviators had, in the fleet problems of the 1930s, where they would have, carrier versus carrier. They would have a carrier attack Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese were paying attention too, by the way. And I would say there's a historical parallel to the past 10 years. I mean, 10 years ago, the People's Liberation Army Navy was invited to participate in RIMPAC exercises, and no
That's right.
longer. But in the early 1930s, the Americans and Japanese, and again, this is in the movie Midway, where Leighton is talking to Yamamoto. They all did exchange tours in each other's countries. But so Waldron knew whatever it takes, I'm going to lead my guys here. So he told his guys on the eve of the battle, it's gonna be tough, guys. And I think that on the first wave, I think half of us are going to get shot down. Then we'll come back and we'll bring out what we can, and probably another half on the second wave. but if we got any left, we'll go that night. Now, can you imagine you're a JO sitting there listening to this? And I mean, yeah,
No.
okay, you're looking around there. Okay, half of my best friends in the world, half of us tomorrow. The CO said,
Yeah.
and this is where John Waldron wrote his famous letter. Just to let you know, I think we're ready. I want us to do our utmost, go in and get a hit, and that letter is at the National Naval Aviation Museum, and of course I cite it in my novel. John Waldron he argued with his air wing commander his air group commander on the radio, and he said, I'm out of here. And he took his guys away, but he took them right to the Japanese and obviously attacked, and the Japanese caught them. John Waldron, courageous and determined. John Waldron, insubordinate and reckless. But both are true.
A fine line between the two, isn't it? Is that not why his name is not attached to very much these days? Again, we hear McCluskey, we hear of Mitcher, some of these other names, Nimitz, but I can't think of anything.
Had Waldron lived, what would have happened to him? I mean, he tells his group commander to go jump in the lake. Again, family language for this family podcast here. It was saltier than that. There's Waldron Field in Corpus Christi, and there was a destroyer named for John Waldron, and John Waldron and BT-8, heroes of Midway. But as the years go by, and I called him a hero, and have told his story over the years. But as more comes out, was that the best thing to do? A case can be made that Waldron attacked, all lost. But it put the Japanese in disarray. There's destroyers that are making smoke and brings the cap down. And then 30 minutes later, VT-6 from Enterprise did the same thing and attacked, and most of them got shot down, 3 or 4 survivors. And then about 20 minutes later is when VT-3 from Yorktown shows up and attacks, because they see this commotion on the horizon, see the smoke, they see the AAA, and you can see it on the sharp horizon. Okay, there they are. And then McCluskey and Leslie, the Japanese cap was down low. The ships had been turning all day, healing, and they can't get the launch up. So it absolutely, it was the efforts, the sacrifice of those 3 torpedo squadrons. It's not fair that writers like me concentrate on Waldron. It was also Lem Massey and oh gosh, who am I missing? It'll come to me in a moment. I'm ashamed of myself. The other 2 squadrons also went to their death.
While you're thinking of it, I'll confess I never did a tour in Texas, so I didn't realize would you say
Yes,
Corpus?
uh-huh.
That field is named after. Okay, so I didn't know that.
It just came to me, Lieutenant Commander Gene Lindsay, yes. And Gene Lindsay had hurt himself in a crack up a few days earlier, but he somehow was helped into the cockpit and said, I'm going to fly this one, and lost his life.
Oh, wow. So you touched on like the radios. Obviously, they didn't have the kind of tools we have these days with data link and inertial navigation systems, GPS and all that. So, I mean, the fog of war must have been significant. And I have to think on both sides, because even once some of these forces that you've described, and it's hard for me to keep all the names straight, so bear with me if I don't get it right. I won't even try, but someone finally finds them, and then that produces a beacon, if you will, for the reasons you stated. You see the AAA bursting at altitude and the smoke from the ships. But otherwise, like for the commanders on the ships, they have no idea what's going on until people come back and land and debrief them.
That's
Is
right.
that essentially true?
The radios were bad, and so Waldron finds the Japanese, and he transmits on the radio. Has sighted the enemy, and he said, Stanhope rings. Stanhope from Johnny 1 has sighted the enemy, and then they drone in. Stanhope, answer. Ring did not hear that transmission, but other aviators and radioman gunners in the Hornet formation did. But no one piped up and said, hey, sir, we're hearing Skipper Waldron on the radio. He's got something. That didn't happen. And as bad as the American radios were, and here's another one. This is the famous "Come on down, Jim" transmission. And from the Enterprise or torpedo bombers. So they find the Japanese, and they want the Enterprise fighters to come down and help them. So they make that transmission, but the fighter squadron didn't hear it. And but the Japanese had much worse radios. The Japanese heroes had radios. They ignored them. They didn't use them. What the Japanese did, you're going to be amazed at this. They would circle overhead the task force, and screen ships would see an enemy approach. So screen ships would start firing their guns in that direction. And that would turn the fighter pilot's eyes to that direction, and they would pick up the enemy visually. I mean, that was the early warning that those guys had. Radar. Radar existed, and radar was used by the Brits. In 1940, the Battle of Britain probably saved it. And so the Japanese knew about radar too, but the Americans had actually put it on their carriers like Yorktown. It saved it later that afternoon. The Japanese had one radar set, but it was 600 miles behind them on a battleship that didn't see any action.
Uh-huh.
If they had radar, radar gives you time, obviously, and they would have seen the threat much earlier. They could have done something about it.
All right, so Hozer, we've painted a fairly bleak picture of day one of the Battle of Midway. Clearly, things turn around. Give us a quick synopsis of once the Japanese fleet is discovered, what do the rest of that first day look like in the next couple of days?
That afternoon, aircraft from Yorktown, which had been attacked and torpedoed by the Japanese carrier Hiryu, they found the Japanese carrier Hiryu. So Enterprise and Hornet cobbled together what they had, because they had terrible losses, mostly due to fuel starvation, but obviously they had lost airplanes to enemy fire. So they put together what they could with a lot of Yorktown survivors over on Enterprise, and they launched about 150 miles away, pretty close, not bad. They didn't have any fighter help, and they found late in the afternoon found the carrier Hiryu and rolled in on it and put 4 bombs in it, which fatally, mortally wounded it. That night, the ship had a big explosion, and so they abandoned ship. Hiryu floated the next day, and there's a very famous image of the whole the bow, the flight deck is gone, but the carrier is floating there. So we realized, okay, the Japanese. I mean, again, the fog of war. Oh my gosh, the Japanese have a carrier. We got to sink it. Well, it couldn't operate. It had already been abandoned. But this is what we think. So during the night, Spruance had moved his forces to the east prudently, because the Japanese, he was afraid were going to engage him at night, and that would not have been good for him. Also during the night, the Japanese realized we can't win, so they started heading home. So a very long-range mission now to find this mythical 4th Japanese carrier, which is now sunk. The Japanese had scuttled it. We came across late in the day a Japanese destroyer, so 25 dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet rolled in on it. None of them were able to hit it. But they and one of our aircraft was shot down. And so those guys had now to come back at night. And so the question was asked, how are you guys, any experience at night? And the answer is most of our guys have never landed an airplane on a ship at night. And so this was their first time. And this was also a case where Spruance and Mitzer, but led by Spruance because he's the admiral, turn on the lights. So they turned on the lights for the guys so they could come back and have just a chance of getting aboard. And most of them did. A very famous story about LSO Robin Lindsay. The flight deck is just packed. So he's still waving guys aboard and waves the last guy like on what you and I would consider the one wire, just to get him aboard. Story in itself on that. And then on June 6th, there was 2 Japanese cruisers that had collided. The Marines, of course, are fighting, and I'm not giving enough credit to the Marine Corps. They fought on the morning of June 4th. They tried to attack the Japanese that night from Midway, and on June 5th, they went out and contributed to the attacks on the 2 Japanese cruisers. So mop-up duty. And those stories are not told in the Midway narrative. I mean, it's, the morning of June 4th is everything, and then it kind of ends. And that's the way the movie was. Actually, I'll take that back. They did show the afternoon strike. But what the movie showed is one ship, one squadron, Richard Best, who was a hero. But there's a lot more going on.
So, in the end of what would be considered the Battle of Midway as they go their separate ways, what's sort of the tally, if there is such a thing? I know there was damage on both sides. Clearly, many aircraft shot down.
There was about 300 American airplane. I'm sorry, 300 American lives were lost.
Okay.
Over 100 airplanes, probably 150 airplanes. We lost the carrier Yorktown. Yorktown would have been salvaged, but the Japanese got a submarine among our screen, sank the
Right. It was being
yes,
towed
and
out,
sank
right?
the destroyer Hammond,
Mhm.
and Yorktown rolled over and sank the next morning, which is also, and I've got one of my Lloyd Childers, who was a Yorktown VT rear gunner. He was picked up by the destroyer Balch, and so he witnessed it. And well, I wrote historic fiction, but that happened, and much of the dialogue is on the record. The Japanese, though, lost four frontline carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They lost one of their cruisers, one heavily damaged. They could never recover from this. So what happened? You and I know when you're in a fight, you let's say you find yourself defensive, and you don't go from defensive to offensive. You go to neutral, defensive, neutral, then offensive. At Midway, the Americans were able to go neutral with the Japanese. And 2 months later, the Americans led the initiative at Guadalcanal. And there was carnage in the Solomon Islands throughout the rest of 1942. Two great big carrier battles, all the surface gunfire action. The Japanese brought there was severe fighting on both sides, and the Japanese gave good account of themselves. But after that, they did not have the arsenal of democracy, and it was just an avalanche of steel that the United States could build and send into the Pacific that doomed them.
Would you say then the Battle of Midway was the turning point?
Ed Beakley, who has a great site called Remembered Sky, uh, and I'm going to quote here. He says, "Midway is the day from which all days followed." So Midway was the day that proved to the world, even to the most staid battleship guy, look, these airplanes really can change the course of warfare. So much so that battleship over there, we're just going to use it for shore bombardment. Um, it it was a turning point. A case can be made, and that the Solomons campaign was really the turning point. We started marching there because again, the Japanese met us at the Solomons, and it was months of hard fighting. But at Midway, neutral, we didn't have to worry. And so this gets into the world aspect of Midway, and I'm going to credit James Schlesinger and my late friend George Walsh, because we won at Midway. We were then able to land forces at North Africa in 1942 and not concentrate on the Pacific. Had we lost, we would have won the Pacific War, but we would have had to concentrate our resources on Japan, who had attacked us, and the American public is angry with. Um, because we were able to attack North Africa and put pressure on Germany, that took pressure off Russia, so they were able to eventually prevail. And you can see that maybe had we lost, we would not have been at Midway. I'm sorry, at Normandy on June 6, 1944. And if we weren't, could not Soviet Russia just kept moving across all of Germany and the Low Countries? And the answer, they could have, because we weren't there to meet them. So Midway gets short shrift from world historians about its importance.
Well, that's why we're spending a little time on it. So, but yeah, like you said, in June of 42, boy, we were a long ways from, there were still 3 more years of
Yes,
slugging it out, fighting, including up at Iwo Jima. Now, I had a tour in Japan, and I was fortunate to be able to go to Iwo Jima. They now call it Iwo To, and it's still Japanese. But there was a lot of memorials there and a lot of remnants of the battle. Of course, that was a very vicious
yes.
hand to hand battle. I know you haven't been to Midway either, but do you know? I mean, what's there today? I assume there are some monuments to the fighting, but what's on Midway? It's obviously not a clipper stop
On
anymore.
Midway is it's run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I think it's full of albatrosses and frigate birds. There is a runway on Sand Island, but in 1942, the Marines took off from Eastern Island. That was their airfield, And Sand Island, which is the larger of the two, it had the Navy seaplane base, and there was plenty of Marine infantry and anti-aircraft. But now there's a runway there, and sleepy place. There is a monument to the battle. It's the thing about Midway. You can't really go there. You can't. There's just thousands of miles of trackless sea. You can go to Gettysburg, you can go to Antietam and other battlefields here in the United States. You can go to Normandy. It's easy for those battles to get a lot of public interest because you can actually go there and touch it. Midway is water and air.
Well, it clearly has made a difference in history. And again, maybe it's not as well known, but there is an airport. Like, as I said at the top, there is a carrier, which we've done a show on. It's here in San Diego as a museum now, just barely missed the war. And of course, the island itself is still there. So very interesting stuff, Hozer. I know we've been at it a while. I've got some listener questions.
Sure.
Are you willing? Okay. And some of these we may have already covered, but we can always just give them a quick answer. Jared wants to know, wasn't the SBD outdated by the time the battle started in 1942? And I think we did cover that one.
We had nothing newer. 2 years later, the SB-2C Helldiver came on the scene, maybe the end of 1943. And that was not a pilot's aircraft. That was son of a B, second class. I mean, it was a difficult, unforgiving airplane to fly. It was bigger and carried more, but
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily say it was better. But it did have range and payload. But the Dauntless in 1942, that was a great airplane. And I'm going to add this. I'll add this, that in World War II, the United States Navy Dauntlesses sank more tonnage than surface ships or submarines. And I shouldn't say Dauntlesses. I should say dive bombers. Forgive me. But the Dauntless and the Helldiver sank more than surface ships or submarines.
So which one was it? And forgive me, I can't keep it all straight. That was the torpedo.
The TBD
Devastator.
and that was it for the TBD. Never used again.
Okay.
Another airplane that the Marines used at Midway is the Vultee Vindicator after Midway, and the Brewster Buffalo fighter. They weren't used anymore in World War II after Midway.
All right. Joe Kunzler asks, how did these pilots in their Dauntlesses and presumably the other aircraft with no radar navigation find their way to the Japanese fleet? And so this was what I was wondering earlier, but I knew Joe was going to ask it. So they were, like you said, they were given a bearing. We think they're here. And I guess one question I have, Hozer, is why didn't the fleets just close on each other? I mean, was there obviously concern for if we can reach them, they can reach us? So it's
yes,
kind of two questions.
And there's Admiral Fletcher on Yorktown was reticent to put his ships where Admiral Nimitz told him to put them. We knew within 5 miles and 5 minutes, because of the great work of Blayton and Rochefort, where they were. Now, when you get someone in Makalapa Hill saying they're going to be here at this time, what? Yep. I don't know, because I'm the one that's out there in the fleet. So Fletcher kept his ships away. Fletcher sent a search that morning from Yorktown, which made Yorktown's deck not ready for offensive action, which Nimitz told him not to do. He didn't want carrier airplanes to be seen by the Japanese. He just wanted the PBYs from Midway to find them. So they did, and they Morse code. Here they are, and our guys attacked them. The first part of your question is, how do the guys in the SBD find it? Well, there was a tray underneath the instrument panel of the SBD, and on that tray, you pull it out, and you've got a plexiglass maneuvering board that we're familiar with, which is really a compass rose, and you're in the middle. And so imagine flying the airplane. You're pulling this out kind of by your chest here. You got a grease pencil in your hand. Okay, I'm here 240, and you figure, okay, there's the seas. I'm making about 2 miles a minute, maybe 3 miles a minute if I'm lucky, and you time an hour and a half, and you're looking at your fuel, and you're looking for where are they, and then let's say you get into battle, and now who knows where you are. Now you have to find your way home, and you just kind of say, okay, I guess I'll just fly the reciprocal 060, and and to find my way. They did have a radio means to home in on their ships, but that's it. That's how they did it.
Well, otherwise, eyeballs, and I think you said earlier,
Yes.
binoculars. Crazy. John Clark wants to know, what were the top lessons learned by the U.S. in the Pacific after the analysis of this battle?
Well, we're not gonna use a TBD anymore. That's a good question. It's a difficult question. I think that yes, the first one to find the enemy is going to win. We had some tough times in the South Pacific at the Battle of Eastern Solomons, and especially the Battle of Santa Cruz, where Hornet was torpedoed and subsequently scuttled. The learning did not
Hmm.
end on June 4th, 5th, or 6th. You get new people in new ships, and oftentimes you have to learn the same old lessons. I think that uh,
Yeah.
I do think that a lesson learned was from Jimmy Thatch and his beam defense maneuver, which was taught throughout the fleet then to great effect. And of course, we got the Hellcat fighter. They realized after Midway, we need more fighters on in our air groups. Uh, as you may know, they used to store spare fighters in the overhead in the hangar bay, and they bring them down, put the wings on them, and put oil in the engine, and off they went.
Crazy. Scott Manning wants to know if we can talk about the B-26
Yeah,
Marauder's role at Midway. I don't remember reading about that, but maybe I missed it.
yeah. It's a couple pages in my novel. This is the very famous flight down Akagi's flight deck by First Lieutenant Murray. The Air Force, excuse me, the Army Air Force, they had rigged torpedoes to their B-26s. Now, the B-26 looks a lot like a B-25 Mitchell that attacked Japan, the Doolittle raid. The B-26 has a single tail, but pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, gunners, radio, the standard, 5 or 6 guys in the aircraft. So 4 of these airplanes attacked the Japanese with B-17s from Midway, with the Dauntlesses and Vindicators flown by the Marines at Midway, with the 5 or 6 Avengers flown by the Navy from Midway. 2 of the B-26s were shot down, although they did shoot down a Japanese Zero. But one of the gunners got one, and but one just kept going in, dropped the torpedo, and then ended up flying down the length of Akagi's deck. And eyewitnesses from Mitsuo Fushida, who was there on the bridge, there's artwork of this that I've seen. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess they had nowhere else to go, just fly right down their throat. With a gunner in the nose and the glass nose of this thing, with a 30 cal, shooting at sailors on the deck, and 2 Japanese sailors lost their lives in that attack. I mean,
Wow.
they just talk courage. They're going to go into the teeth of that enemy fire.
Well, that was on display readily, I would say, at the Battle of Midway. Courage. All right. George Bravo wants to know, how close did the U.S. Navy get to losing the Battle of Midway?
A case can be made if McCluskey hadn't seen that destroyer down there. He was going to go back. He was going to go as far as he absolutely could stretch it. Then he would have gone back instead of putting 30 aircraft in the water. The Japanese knew where the Americans were, and the Japanese would have attacked, and that would have changed the course of that battle. The Hiryu in the afternoon with just dive bombers was able to get through Yorktown's fighters, who shot down a lot of dive bombers, but Yorktown suffered a couple of hits, blew out her boilers, snuffed her boilers, so she's dead in the water. You see the famous picture of black smoke, and that's from her engineering spaces. But within an hour and a half, they were able to get steam up, and so she starts moving out, and then the Japanese came at her again, and this is the torpedo attack led by Lieutenant Tomonaga, with Maruyama, one of the Japanese that I concentrate in my book. He was in that attack also. So pretty close when you think about it. I mean, the Japanese were outstanding naval aviators and knew how to use their aircraft.
Mm. All right, last listener question, and this is a little off topic, but you, having written your book Fight Fight, can probably answer this one. Let's ponder, says John F., what a modern Battle of Midway might look like. And of course, I don't think anyone's going to battle for that little island, but move a couple thousand miles west, and you might have something like this, huh?
I think that it's a great question. At tremendous distances, obviously, what do you have to do? You have to be able to navigate, communicate, and then target. Satellites, don't expect them. The use of radio, no. We're going to be dropping bean bags from Seahawk helicopters on one deck to another, and visual semaphore blinking light when you can get away with it. But we're not gonna have all the GPS stuff that we think we have. Now, who's going to be able to fight better in that environment, a satellite denied environment? I,
Yeah.
and so that's the question that has to be asked. But there's gray zone stuff that's going to come into play. There's allies. It's going to be the entire Western Pacific is going to be the theater.
It's tempting to think that we would be so much more advanced than we were 79 years ago with, again, data link and radios and satellite and everything else. But like you said, if the balloon really goes up, and let's all hope it doesn't, but if it does, of course, a lot of that could be denied. It could go right back to where you were. Go on a distance, out on a bearing, I should say. Look for the enemy and engage them. Now the weapons will be different. The speeds will definitely be different. But let's hope we never have to answer John's question for real.
Yes.
All right, Hoser. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Just real quick, back to Silver Waterfall. Why did you write that? What was kind of your motivation? And it's a little different than what you've written before, isn't it?
Yes, and it's a book that I'm glad I wrote it when I did after I learned from writing the first three about being a better craftsman. But I was a squadron XOCO, and I knew that naval history was a shortfall among all of us, and so I would go to the squadron to Gedunk, and I'd see a sailor, and I'd say, "Hey, I'll buy your root beer if you can tell me, who said don't give up the ship, fight her till she sinks, or what ship was John Paul Jones on when he did battle with the HMS Serapis, and sometimes they knew, oftentimes not. And I say, okay, well, who's your division officer? And Lieutenant Smith. Okay, well, find Lieutenant Smith, and you ask him that question, and you come to me with the answer. And it was fun, and kind of get the guys thinking about history. But we were on Enterprise. We're going across the Atlantic on deployment, and so I did put together a PowerPoint brief about the Battle of Midway, and I just wanted to talk to the ready room about the things we talked about today, and but thinking about our heritage. So I called the guys into the ready room. They had to be there, and I went over this in PowerPoint form, and I said, "Are there any questions?" And there were no questions because they all wanted to go to Midrats. And so I said, "Okay, no one leaves till I get 3 questions," which I quickly got. And so everyone got out of there in time for Midrats. But I got some good reviews, like grudgingly, yeah, Skipper, I guess that was all right. But it's something that I like talking about, obviously, and just
Yeah.
wanted to write this book as a tribute to those guys for what they did. We should never forget what those guys did for us.
Well, I mean, I don't think we barely even touched on it today. And again, there's no possible way to relive the fear they must have had and the uncertainty of what the end would be. But of course, we know that today. And so we're all better for their sacrifices. But good stuff, Hoser. All right. Anything else? What did I not ask you about the Battle of Midway that I should before we wrap up?
I think yeah, we've covered a lot, and yeah, it's been a great show. I think we've covered quite a bit.
All right. Well, before we go, and I'll let you go in a moment, can you remind everyone where they can find you and your books? You did say your website earlier. If you could say it again, and where can we follow you on social media if we'd like?
KevinMillerAuthor.com, and I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And here's the Silver Waterfall, which you should buy at the Fighter Pilot Podcast website, and which has a link to it. And that's the place that all of your listeners should go first. But you can find it on
That's right.
Amazon. You can go to your local independent bookstore and ask for it by name, and they'll get it for you. They have a mechanism to do that.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the plug, Hoser. I think if we sell your book on Amazon, it doesn't cost you anything more. I think Amazon gives us like 13 cents. So, but it adds up. So I do appreciate it.
You bet, Jim.
All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. We're going to transition then to our wrap up. I just want to remind everyone that the views expressed in this presentation are the personal views of myself and my guest and do not necessarily represent the position of the Department of Defense or its components. Hozer, thanks for coming back again. You are our first two-time guest on the Fighter Pilot Podcast, sir.
Thanks for having me, Jello. Had fun.
Well, that'll do it for this week. We'll see you back here in 10 days for a show on how NASA is involved in military aviation. You won't want to miss it. We'll see you then. Take care.
You've been listening to the Fighter Pilot Podcast, brought to you by BBR Productions. Got a question for the show? Email us at questions@fighterpilotpodcast.com or leave a message on our listener line, 877-MACH-101. That's 877-622-4101. Be sure to follow us on your favorite social media platform and check out our website, fighterpilotpodcast.com. For exclusive content and to help support the show, check out our Patreon page. Thanks for listening.